Something is very different about the gaming industry between now and a couple decades ago. No, not DLC. No, not loot boxes. No, not streaming or day one patches either. Rather, it feels like all those definitions about what it means to be a generation of gaming have just sort of up and melted. To understand why, let's go back to 2014. Looking back, 2014 was a fascinating year for the AAA game industry, but I'm saying fascinating to refer to a very specific trend that popped up at the time. And I'm not trying to be overly cynical because there are a ton of fantastic games out there in the sphere of modern gaming, but I remember this being a trend that left a lot of us a bit cold. What's more, it's a trend that to my eyes exposed a certain truth about today's gaming world compared to how it was back in the 90s or the 2000s. Let's find out why. When a new console generation launches, from what I've seen, there's always mixed emotions, usually tethered around the fact that people are going to have to pony up around $50,000 in order to play the new exclusives. It's a landscape where the executives are living at large and breathlessly touting all the new features, and the average adult fan is wringing their hands wondering how they're possibly going to fit this thing into their budget this year. It's a far cry from the console launch cycles of our childhoods, which for many of us exist as rose-tinted memories of clamoring around the Christmas tree, knowing that big box was going to be the brand new console we were so excited for. But something was different on the development end when the PS4 and Xbox One launched, and appropriately enough, I had mixed feelings about it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the year the next gen wasn't exactly the next gen. If you take a look at a lot of the big name titles that came out around that generation transition, you start to notice something very specific. Big names like Destiny, Shadow of Mordor, The Evil Within, Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, and others all came out simultaneously on both generations. You'd get a PS3 version dropping the same time as the PS4 version. Now this is not unheard of. The Legend of Zelda's done this a couple times, with Twilight Princess launching simultaneously on the Wii and the GameCube, and Breath of the Wild on the Wii U and the Switch. But this was a whole slew of big budget titles coming down the pipeline all at once, such that we can consider this a full-fledged trend at that time. You can see the upshot of this pretty easily, especially if you were one of the millions wringing their hands at the thought of suddenly stuffing a $500 console into your budget when you're already living hand to mouth. It meant that if you were a console gamer who wasn't in a position to pick up a new system within the year it launched, you had a state of grace of sorts, where you could still play the new hotness, instead of just watching videos and streams to see it secondhand. And from that very particular viewpoint, there's a certain wisdom in doing the generational shift this way. Players didn't have to feel totally locked out if they, or depending on their age, their parents didn't necessarily have money for a new console at launch. But when you take the financials out of it, it was all a double-edged sword, and I remember way more skepticism of it all back when this was happening, for a couple reasons. First, for the hundreds and hundreds of dollars they were asking us for the new consoles, having most of these big-budget launch titles available on the past generation made the whole generation leap feel so much less special. Yes, the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions of these titles had some performance issues, and the graphical fidelity wasn't quite as high as their next-gen counterparts, but you could still essentially play them on your old consoles. Compare this to earlier generations. Part of the excitement of a new console launch used to be that we would be receiving games that flat out could not be made on an earlier console. To our child minds that couldn't wait to get home from school to play games, a new console meant that all those fantasy worlds we loved were about to see a quantum leap. If you were playing games in 2001, think back to the GameCube launch, and if you had yet to join us here on Earth at the time, just imagine. Those lighting effects in Luigi's Mansion would never have worked on the Nintendo 64. And the previews of Star Fox Adventure showed off those water effects, and the detailed fur effects on Fox and Crystal that still more or less hold up today. Again, not even remotely possible on any permutation of the Nintendo 64 hardware. But by doing this double generation strategy with the launch of what is now the current console generation, they made it so that the leap from the PS3 to PS4, or from the 360 to the Xbox One, really didn't feel like we were witnessing a quantum leap of technical gains like with past generations. But don't get me wrong, the current generation did quickly reach a point where you were seeing things on PS4 and Xbox One that you just wouldn't have been able to see on earlier consoles. But even then, when I say that, I'm talking about graphical fidelity mainly. It's not a total paradigm shift like when the mid-90s introduced true 3D with the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation. Before that, games like Doom and Nintendo's Mode 7 technology managed to trick our eyes with a convincing facsimile of 3D, but true 3D in action blew our damn minds at the time. I gotta ask, have the last couple generations really provided anything like that? More to the point, can they? And I'm sure a part of that is in how high-end gaming already looks so good that from where we are now, you can only jump so far before you reach diminishing returns. To be totally clear, I'm not talking about the raw data or how much processing the new hotness can blast. I'm talking about our simple human ability to perceive the difference. Which begs the question, are we starting to see diminishing returns on how much of a leap is possible between new generations? All that said, there is one significant part of the gaming world that remains completely unaffected by all this. There's a huge market for and supply of games that decide to completely ignore this notion of trying to push forward with as much visual fidelity as possible, and just making good games the way the makers want to make them. And the quote-unquote indie marketplace is jam-packed with games that have completely unmoored themselves from the expectations of bigger budget games and the tropes of their time. Mind you, just because a game doesn't bother with the diminishing returns of the endless arms race of graphical fidelity does not mean that it is a quote-unquote throwback title. Look at a game like Hollow Knight. Even though the game is a 2D Metroidvania with a design structure that could have easily been done on the Super Nintendo, the graphical fidelity within that 2D world is easily PS2 era quality at least. And it would make me wonder if these types of games are possibly going to emerge as another type of leader in the gaming marketplace, but that's the thing, they kind of already have. We no longer exist in a state where the big publishers rule the roost, and the community of indie creators is shuffled off to the side like some niche thing. No, we're well beyond that. You'll find plenty of players for whom these smaller titles are their bread and butter as opposed to the bigger titles from major studios. When I think of the console generations of the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, there's a very clear divide between the pre-NES era, the 8-bit era, 16 bits, 32 bits, and 64 bits. I'm not going to go into a breakdown of how we were all taken for a ride by the bit wars, because James Rolfe already made that video. But when someone says 8-bit, you think of stuff like Super Mario Bros. Someone says 32-bit, you think of something like Crash Bandicoot. It's very specific. But that doesn't really exist anymore in an era where the new hotness can be anything from a cinematic epic with high-fidelity visuals or a 2D action game that takes its visual cues from any era that it chooses. And at the end of the day, I think this is a fantastic thing. Those big spectacles are still always going to exist, but this indie market has effectively decentralized the gaming industry. What that means for you is that instead of most of the major creators being saddled with the expectations and oversight that come from a big corporate budget, we get a world where countless game creators simply don't need to give a shit about that if they don't want to. Wow, this really spiraled out of control. I started this intending to talk about something so simple from about half a decade ago. Something that sounded like a funny little quirk on the surface. But, you know, that whole generational divide around late 2014 may well have been the fracture point that made me think harder about the points that I just talked about, because it revealed something about the way we look at generations today as opposed to yesterday. And maybe that's what I really hoped for with this video, to get thinking a bit deeper about the kinds of thing we tend to take for granted in the modern age. And I don't want this to come off like some old grouch who spends his time muttering angrily to himself that all the entertainment you like now has less to it than all the entertainment that he liked then. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. Instead, I'll leave you with something that I think is very cool. Maybe what all that means is mission freaking accomplished. Games as a medium have reached a point where we had hoped they would be back when us 90s kids were playing Super Nintendo and thinking about all the ways gaming could evolve from there. We live in a world where massive epics with colossal budgets coexist with indie platformers that can get just as much distribution as the big name titles. Almost any type of game you want, there's probably something out there that'll fill you up. That's what I mean when I call this the era of the blurred generations. If there aren't any more quantum leaps to be had until we get into things like, I don't know, advancements in VR and whatever else the future might hold, then maybe that's because we're already so close to being where we hoped we would be. And there will always be advancements none of us can see coming right now. The future marches on, and it always will. But looking deeper at this, I'm excited for what we've got coming tomorrow, but I'm also super happy about what we've got for ourselves today. But either way, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.